He was born in the shadows, not of poverty, but of the gray, suffocating atmosphere of provincial respectability that often breeds the most tempestuous passions. Maximilien Marie Isidore de Robespierre saw the light of day on May 6, 1758, in the town of Arras in northern France. His family belonged to the gentry of the robe, noblesse de robe, hereditary lawyers. It seemed his life was planned in advance: studies, a law practice, an advantageous marriage, and a quiet retirement as a judge. But fate dealt him a blow that would forever alter his soul. When Maximilien was only 6 years old, his mother died. She passed away in childbirth after delivering her 5th child. His father, François de Robespierre, an unstable and passionate man, could not overcome this grief. He simply vanished. He abandoned his practice, his home, and his 4 young children. Stories of how idealists become inquisitors are always relevant. They remind us that the road to hell is not only paved with good intentions, but also with the absolute conviction of one's own infallibility. It is precisely such fates and the mechanisms of power and fanaticism that we explore here. If you want to learn what is often left out of the history books, subscribe to our channel, Personalities in Detail. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and dive with us into the true abysses of history. The youngest child died shortly after their mother, and the father wandered across Europe, eventually dying in complete obscurity somewhere in Bavaria. The 6-year-old Maximilien became an orphan with a living father. He became the head of the family. This early experience of loss and responsibility left an indelible mark on him. He grew serious beyond his years, withdrawn and suspicious. He learned to hide his feelings behind a mask of icy composure. A sense of the world's profound injustice took root in his soul, and perhaps also a subconscious hatred of fathers, of any authority that abandons its children. His grandfather and aunts took him in. They provided him with an education. He was a brilliant student. At 11, he received a scholarship to the prestigious Collège Louis le Grand in Paris. There, within the cold walls of that institution, he met the man who would become his only true friend for the rest of his life, Camille Desmoulins, a stuttering, fiery boy whose head he would send into the executioner's basket years later. At the college, Robespierre immersed himself in the world of antiquity. He read Plutarch, Cicero, Tacitus. He lived not in 18th century Paris, but in ancient Rome and Sparta. He dreamed of a republic, of civic virtue, of heroes who sacrificed their lives for their country. But his most important teacher, his God, became Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Robespierre absorbed every word of Quote Zero. The idea that the people are sovereign, that virtue is the foundation of the state, and that civilization has corrupted man became his religion. It is said that the young student Robespierre saw Rousseau shortly before his death, strolling in the park at Ermenonville. This encounter, whether real or apocryphal, became a sacred initiation for him. He decided to dedicate his life to realizing Rousseau's ideas. After completing his studies, he returned to Arras and became a lawyer. And here, the paradox that would always haunt him emerged. Robespierre, the future architect of the Terror, began his career as a humanist. He took on the cases of the poor and oppressed. He defended peasants against landowners. He won the famous lightning rod case, proving that science was not witchcraft. He wrote essays passionately arguing against the death penalty. Human life is sacrosanct, he wrote. The death penalty is barbarism. In Arras, he was known as the defender of the oppressed. He was elegant, always impeccably dressed, powdered even when powder had gone out of fashion, polite. Yet there was a certain frightening coldness about him. He never laughed. He drank no wine. Women did not interest him, though he wrote them gallant poems. He was married to his idea. He was as pure as crystal and as hard as a diamond, and he was waiting for his hour. That hour struck in the year 1789. France, ruined by debt and poor harvests, was seething. King Louis XVI convened the Estates General. Robespierre, only 30 years old, was elected as a deputy for the Third Estate from Arras. He did not travel to Versailles to make a career. He went there to save France. In his suitcase, he carried not a change of clothes, but the blueprints for a new world. When Robespierre arrived in Versailles, he was a nobody. A small, slender man with glasses, a quiet voice, and a nervous twitch. Against the backdrop of brilliant orators like the Comte de Mirabeau, he seemed like a gray mouse. When he first took the rostrum, the deputies paid him no attention. They talked amongst themselves. They laughed. The newspapers even mixed up his name, calling him Robert Pierre. But he did not give up. He returned to the rostrum again and again. He spoke in a quiet, monotonous voice, but what he said was like acid eating away at the old order. He was the only one who consistently, with fanatical stubbornness, defended the principles of democracy. He demanded universal suffrage when others wanted to grant it only to the wealthy. He called for freedom of the press, the abolition of slavery in the colonies, and the destruction of class privileges. His strength lay not in charisma, but in logic and an absolute belief in his own righteousness. Mirabeau, that lion of the revolution, once looked at him and spoke the prophetic words, "This man will go far, for he believes everything he says." Other deputies could be bribed, could compromise. Robespierre, never. He lived in a modest room at the home of the carpenter Duplay, ate simple food, and did not accept a single penny. At a time when corruption was the norm, he earned the nickname that became his shield and his sword, the incorruptible, l'Incorruptible. The revolution gained momentum. The Bastille fell. The king was brought to Paris. The Estates General became the National Assembly, and with every turn of history's wheel, Robespierre grew stronger. He understood that his true power lay not in the assembly hall where the wealthy bourgeoisie sat, but on the streets. He became the idol of the Jacobin Club, the place where the most radical revolutionaries gathered. There, before his audience, he honed his speeches. He spoke in the name of the people. He identified with the people. "I am not the defender of the people," he said. "I am the people." Yet, parallel to his growing popularity, his suspicion also grew. He saw enemies everywhere. He watched as the heroes of the revolution, Mirabeau, Lafayette, Varennes, one by one tried to halt the revolution, to compromise with the king, to betray the people. And he began his great hunt. He became the prosecutor of the revolution. His speeches transformed into indictments. But now, back to Paris, where the shadow of the guillotine was already beginning to fall over the city. In 1791, the king attempted to flee, but was caught in Varennes. The masks were off. The monarchy was collapsing. Robespierre, who had recently argued against the death penalty, now demanded blood. Louis must die so that the nation may live, he declared. This was a terrible logic. If the king is innocent, then the revolution is a crime. Therefore, the king must be guilty. On January 21st, 1793, the head of Louis XVI fell into the basket. Robespierre stood at the foot of the scaffold. He had killed the father of the nation. Now he was ready to kill his brothers. When Maximilien Robespierre, a 30-year-old lawyer from Arras, arrived in Versailles in May 1789, he was just a drop in the ocean. Among the 600 deputies of the Third Estate who had traveled from all over France, he was a nobody. A small, slender man in a severe dark suit, with glasses and a carefully powdered wig. He was completely lost against the backdrop of brilliant, charismatic leaders like the Comte de Mirabeau, with his magnificent mane of hair and booming voice, or the Abbé Sieyès, whose pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, had become the manifesto of the revolution. When Robespierre first took the rostrum to deliver his first speech, the deputies paid him no attention. They chatted, laughed, and whispered. The newspapers reporting on the session even butchered his name, calling him Robert Pierre, or simply Robert. But he did not give up. He was obsessed. He returned to the rostrum again and again, day after day, week after week. He spoke in a quiet, somewhat shrill, monotonous voice, devoid of any theatrical effects. But what he said was like acid, slowly but surely corroding the rotten supports of the old order. He was the only one who from the very beginning defended with fanatical stubbornness the pure, uncompromising principles of democracy he had drawn from the works of his idol, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. When other deputies, mostly wealthy citizens, proposed a census, a property qualification for voters, Robespierre delivered furious speeches in defense of universal male suffrage. Every man has the right to participate in the creation of the laws to which he submits, he declared. He demanded unrestricted freedom of the press, the abolition of slavery in the colonies, the destruction of all class privileges, and all this with an absolute, almost frightening belief in his righteousness. Mirabeau, that lion of the revolution who had initially scorned him, once looked at him and spoke the prophetic words, "This man will go far, for he believes everything he says." Other deputies allowed themselves to be bribed by the court, made compromises, and changed their views. Robespierre, never. He lived in a modest furnished room, ate simple food. His only luxury was the oranges he laid out on his windowsill. At a time when corruption was the norm and many revolutionaries did not shy away from secret subsidies, he remained impeccably pure. And he earned the nickname that became his shield and his sword, the Incorruptible. The revolution gained momentum. The storming of the Bastille, the women's march on Versailles, the king's move to Paris. The Estates General became the National Assembly, and then the Constituent Assembly. And with every turn of history's wheel, Robespierre grew stronger. He realized that his true power was not in the assembly hall, where the wealthy bourgeoisie who ignored him sat, but on the streets, among the common people of Paris. He became one of the leading figures of the Jacobin Club, which quickly transformed from a discussion salon into the headquarters of the radical revolution, a shadow government with branches all over France. There, in the old monastery library, Before his audience of artisans, journalists, and young intellectuals, he honed his speeches. Here he did not have to shout to be heard. Here they hung on his every word. He spoke in the name of the people. He identified with the people. For the Jacobins, he became an oracle, the voice of pure, unblemished, revolutionary virtue. But along with his growing popularity, his paranoia also grew. He saw enemies and conspirators everywhere. And he was not entirely wrong. He watched as the heroes of the early revolution, Mirabeau, Lafayette, the triumvirate around Varennes, one by one tried to halt the revolution, to come to terms with the king, to create a compromised constitutional monarchy. For Robespierre, any compromise was treason. He began his great hunt. He became the prosecutor of the revolution. His speeches, meticulously prepared and logically constructed, became indictments. He harshly criticized Mirabeau, accusing him, correctly, as was revealed after Mirabeau's death, of secret ties to the royal court. He fought against Lafayette, the commander of the National Guard, seeing in him a potential Caesar, a military dictator. The decisive moment that finally split France and catapulted Robespierre to the forefront was the king's flight to Varennes in June 1791. Louis XVI, who had been hypocritically playing along, tried to flee the country to join the armies of émigrés and foreign monarchs and, with their help, reclaim his absolute power. He was caught and brought back to Paris in disgrace. The masks were off. For Robespierre and the radicals, this was definitive proof that the king was a traitor and that no compromise with the monarchy was possible. The moderate majority in the Assembly, frightened by the events, tried to cover up the scandal by inventing the absurd story of a kidnapping. But the people of Paris could no longer be fooled. A huge crowd gathered on the Champ de Mars to sign a petition demanding the king's deposition and the proclamation of a republic. The moderate government responded with force. The National Guard, under Lafayette's command, opened fire on the unarmed crowd. Dozens of people were killed. This quote 11 tore a bloody chasm between the moderates and the radicals. Robespierre, who also faced arrest, was forced into hiding. The following year was spent in a bitter struggle. The main issue was war. The Girondin party, representing the interests of the big bourgeoisie, immediately demanded a declaration of war on Austria and Prussia. They believed the war would unite the nation and allow the revolution to be exported across Europe. The king and his court secretly supported them, hoping that France would lose and foreign armies would restore their power. Nearly the entire country was gripped by war fever. Yet again, Robespierre swam against the current. At the Jacobin Club, he delivered a series of brilliant, prophetic speeches against the war. He argued that France was unprepared, that the conflict would only strengthen the generals and lead to a military dictatorship, and he warned against the naive plans to liberate Europe. No one listened to him. The war was declared, and it began with disastrous defeats. The French armies fled. The enemy was at the borders. Panic erupted in Paris, fueled by rumors of internal treason, which led to the final, decisive outbreak. On August 10, 1792, armed crowds of sans-culottes and detachments of fédérés from Marseille stormed the royal Tuileries Palace. The monarchy, which had existed in France for 1,000 years, lay in ruins. The king and his family were arrested. Robespierre did not participate in the assault. He was not a man of the barricades, but he was its foremost ideologue. He immediately called for the convening of a new body of power, the National Convention, elected by universal male suffrage, and for the trial of the king. This trial became the main spectacle of the winter of 1792 to 1793. The Girondins, frightened by their own radicalism, tried to save the king's life by proposing the issue be put to a popular referendum. But Robespierre was unyielding. He took the rostrum of the convention and delivered his coldest and most terrifying speech. He declared that this was not a judicial proceeding. It was a horrifying but flawless logic. If the king is innocent, then those who overthrew him are criminals. If the revolution is right, then the king must be guilty. He left the deputies no choice. In January 1793, the convention, by a narrow majority, sentenced Louis XVI to death. On January 21st, on a foggy morning, his head fell into the basket. According to some witnesses, Robespierre stood at the foot of the scaffold with an impenetrable expression, watching the execution. He had committed murder. Now he was ready to take his place and begin killing his own brothers, whom he deemed not virtuous enough. The king's execution did not bring peace to France. It plunged the country into a conflagration the world had never seen. The blood of Louis XVI became the cement that bound the alliance of all European monarchies against the Republic. England, which had remained neutral until then, ended the war. Austria, Prussia, Spain, Holland, and Sardinia joined the coalition. France was surrounded by enemies. Its armies, demoralized and poorly organized, suffered one defeat after another. General Dumouriez, the hero of the cannonade of Valmy, betrayed the revolution and defected to the Austrians. Enemy troops once again stood at the borders, threatening Paris. Inside the country, the chaos was no less severe. The king's execution had caused shock and horror in the provinces. In the Vendée, in western France, a royalist peasant uprising erupted. This was not a simple rebellion. It was a total, fanatical war. The peasants, led by their priests and the local nobility, raised an army. They fought under the white banner of the Bourbons, slaughtering Republican officials and soldiers. This war, filled with mutual cruelty, would claim hundreds of thousands of lives and become a festering wound on the body of France. In major cities, Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, Toulon, moderate Republicans, the Girondins, who had been driven from Paris by the Jacobins, seized power. They raised the banner against the dictatorship of the capital. 60 of France's 83 departments slipped from the central government's control. In Paris itself, famine reigned. The war had brought trade to a standstill. Inflation devalued the paper currency, the assignats. Bread was scarce. Hungry crowds of sans-culottes, artisans, workers, and small merchants demanded radical measures from the convention. The establishment of maximum prices for food, maximum, and a merciless crackdown on speculators. At the forefront of this movement were radical agitators known as the enragés, the enraged ones, and the Jacobins. The Republic was in its death throes. It resembled a besieged fortress where hunger and treason raged within its walls while enemy armies stood outside. Its fall seemed to be a matter of weeks. It was in this atmosphere of total crisis, fear, and paranoia that the most terrible child of the Revolution was born, the Terror, la Terreur. And its chief ideologue, its high priest, became Maximilien Robespierre. He and his party, the Jacobins, or, as they sat on the upper benches of the convention, the mountain, la montagne, offered France a simple and terrible solution. To save the revolution, it was necessary to establish a strong, centralized, dictatorial power that would crush all enemies, both external and internal, with an iron fist and mobilize all the nation's resources for victory. The first step on this path was the destruction of their main political rivals, the Girondins. On June 2, 1793, vast crowds of armed sans-culottes and National Guard detachments, incited by the Jacobins, surrounded the convention building. They aimed cannons at the building and demanded the surrender of the 22 leaders of the Girondins. After hours of humiliating confrontation, the convention yielded, facing the muzzles of the cannons. The Girondins were arrested. This was the end of parliamentary democracy. From now on, power lay not in the hands of the people's elected representatives, but in the alliance of the Jacobin dictatorship with the armed Parisian mob. A month later, an incident occurred that gave the terrorists a completely free hand. On July 13th, a young noblewoman from Normandy, Charlotte Corday, a sympathizer of the Girondins, entered the home of Jean-Paul Marat, the most bloodthirsty of the Jacobin journalists, stabbed the 36-year-old man with a dagger as he sat in his bath. She sought to kill a monster, but her act merely transformed him into a martyr. Marat became a saint of the Revolution. He was given a public funeral. Children were named after him, and his murder became the pretext for intensifying the terror. Cries for vengeance echoed in the streets. In this atmosphere of fear and bloodlust, the Jacobins began to build their machine. In April 1793, the Committee of Public Safety, Comité de Salut Public, was established, an emergency governmental body of 9 and later 12 men, which received virtually unlimited dictatorial powers to wage war. In July, Robespierre joined it. He quickly became its soul, its voice, and its chief ideologue. At his side were his loyal companions, the cold, relentless Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just and Georges Couthon, a paraplegic who used a wheelchair but possessed an iron will. For police matters, another, no less terrible body was created, the Committee of General Security, Comité de Sûreté Générale, a kind of political secret police. The main instrument of both committees, however, became the Revolutionary Tribunal. Robespierre formulated a new, terrifying philosophy of power. It was the chilling logic of a fanatic. To build an ideal, virtuous republic, one must first physically eliminate all its enemies. And enemies were all who did not share his views: moderates who wanted to stop the revolution, radicals who wanted to accelerate it, aristocrats, priests, speculators, or simply the discontented. Anyone could become an enemy. On September 17th, the Law of Suspects, Loi des Suspects, was passed. This law turned all of France into a vast prison camp. Anyone who could not prove their means of subsistence, who was a relative of an émigré, or who merely expressed sympathy for them, was deemed a suspect. Passivity also became a crime. Denunciation became the highest civic virtue. Revolutionary committees were formed in every city to draw up lists of suspects. The prisons filled to capacity, and the guillotine began its work. This mechanism, invented by Dr. Guillotine as a painless and equal instrument of execution for all, became the grim symbol of the terror. Every day, crowds gathered on the Place de la Révolution, today's Place de la Concorde, to watch the executions. The tricoteuses, knitting women, would sit at the foot of the scaffold, knitting and counting the falling heads. At first, the enemies were executed: Queen Marie Antoinette, the arrested Girondins, aristocrats. But very soon, the revolution, like the god Saturn, began to devour its own children. The terror raged not only in Paris, but in the provinces, especially in the rebellious cities. There it took on even more cruel forms. In Lyon, where the uprising had been suppressed with particular brutality, Convention Commissioners Collot d'Herbois and Joseph Fouché, later Napoleon's Minister of Police, decided the guillotine worked too slowly. They began organizing mass shootings, mitraillades, by leading hundreds of condemned people into a field and mowing them down with cannons and grape shot. Quote, 14 Fouché declared. In Nantes, Commissioner Carrier invented the noyades, mass drownings. He herded hundreds of priests and suspects onto old barges, towed them to the middle of the Loire River, and sank them, calling it, quote, 15. But despite all this horror, the machine created by the Jacobins worked. The Committee of Public Safety displayed a monstrous but effective energy. The quote 16 on prices was introduced, temporarily halting starvation in the cities. The quote 17, or mass mobilization, was declared. All of France was turned into an armed camp. Scientists developed new weapons. Factories produced gunpowder. Women sewed uniforms. Within a year, a new Republican army of 1 million men was raised from the ground. And this army, inspired by revolutionary enthusiasm and led by young, talented generals who rose from the lower classes, such as Hoche, Jourdan, and Moreau, began to win. By the end of 1793, the external enemies had been driven back from the borders. The provincial uprisings had been drowned in blood. The Vendée was devastated. The Republic was saved. The terror had seemingly fulfilled its purpose. It had saved France from collapse and foreign invasion. But now that the immediate threat had passed, the question arose, what next? Was it time to stop the guillotine? For many, including one of the chief architects of the terror, Georges Danton, the answer was obvious. Quote, 18 But for Maximilien Robespierre, the real revolution was just beginning. He had saved the Republic. Now he intended to purify it. And this purification would be even bloodier than the war itself. At the start of 1794, the Republic was saved, but it was mortally ill. The disease was the terror itself. It had been a necessary drug during the crisis, but now it was poisoning the entire body of the nation, turning from medicine into poison. France lived in an atmosphere of cloying, paranoid fear. But Robespierre and his closest allies, like Saint-Just, saw the situation differently. For them, victory on the front lines was merely a prelude. The real, most important war The war to purify souls, to create the new, virtuous man, was just beginning. Standing in the way of this radiant utopia were two factions, two cancers that, in their view, were eating away at the body of the Republic from within. On the left were the Hébertists, or ultra-revolutionaries. Their leader was Jacques-René Hébert, publisher of the coarse, vulgar newspaper, quote, 19, quote. They were the mouthpiece of the Parisian sans-culottes, radicals who called for even more terror, for total war until victorious, and, most importantly, for de-Christianization. They staged anti-religious carnivals in Paris, plundered churches, turned them into, quote, 20, and forced priests to renounce their vows. Their atheism was militant and vulgar. For Robespierre, a deist in the spirit of Rousseau, who believed that faith in God and the immortality of the soul were the foundations of morality, these people were not just political opponents. They were immoral barbarians whose godlessness and anarchism compromised the revolution in the eyes of all Europe. He saw them as a direct threat to his project for the Republic. On the right were the indulgents, les indulgents, or Dantonists. Their leader was the giant, the titan of the revolution, Georges Danton. Danton was the complete opposite of Robespierre. He was huge, with a face scarred by smallpox, loud, and a man who loved life in all its forms. Money, women, good wine. He was the embodiment of the revolution itself, of its primal, untamable force. It was he who, in 1792, had saved Paris from the Prussian invasion with his famous cry, quote, 21. He was one of the chief architects of the Terror, the creator of the Revolutionary Tribunal. But now that the external enemies were repelled and the internal uprisings crushed, he believed it was time to stop. He was tired of the blood. He said, together with his friend, the brilliant journalist Camille Desmoulins, with whom Robespierre had once been schoolmates, he began publishing the newspaper, The Old Cordelier. In the initial issues, with Robespierre's own blessing, Desmoulins attacked the Hébertists, but then he grew bolder. In the famous third issue of his paper, under the guise of describing the horrors of the Roman Empire, he painted a thinly veiled and terrifying picture of the Jacobin terror. He called for the establishment of a Committee of Clemency, Comité de Clémence. Do you want to eradicate all your enemies with the guillotine? He wrote. But has there ever been a greater madness? Can you execute one person without making a dozen new enemies among their family and friends? This was a direct challenge to Robespierre. For the Incorruptible, this was treason. He saw it not as a call for humanity, but as a sign of weakness, fatigue, and worst of all, corruption. Danton and his friends made no secret of their love for money. They were involved in shady financial dealings related to the East India Company. For the ascetic Robespierre, who lived on the modest salary of a deputy, this was proof of their moral decay. They were rotten, corrupt. They wanted to halt the revolution to enjoy their spoils in peace. They were enemies of virtue, just like the atheistic Hébertists. Robespierre decided to destroy both factions. He acted like a chess grandmaster, first removing a minor piece from the board to then attack the main one. First, he used the Dantonists' hatred of the Hébertists to deal with the left. In March 1794, Hébert and his companions were arrested on the fabricated charge of a foreign conspiracy and guillotined. The crowd of sans-culottes, who had cheered for them just yesterday, watched their execution in silent indifference. 2 weeks later, it was the right's turn. Danton was certain of his invulnerability. "They will not dare," he told his friends who begged him to flee. "One does not carry one's homeland on the soles of one's shoes." He underestimated Robespierre's cold determination. Robespierre hesitated. To destroy Danton, this colossus, was frightening. But his closest companion, the cold and merciless angel of death, Saint-Just, convinced him. He said, on the night of March 30th, Danton, Desmoulins, and their friends were arrested. Their trial was a farce, a parody of justice. Danton, the greatest orator of the Revolution, was barely allowed to speak. His powerful voice, which could incite a whole city to revolt, was drowned out by the ringing of the judge's bell. "We are being executed on the orders of a few cowardly brigands," he roared from his cage. As he was taken to his execution, the cart passed the house of the carpenter Duplay, where Robespierre lived. The shutters of his room were tightly closed. "Maximilien!" Danton screamed at his invisible enemy. "You will follow me. Your house will be razed to the ground." On April 5th, 1794, Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins ascended the scaffold. Danton's last words to the executioner were, quote, 34. Now Robespierre had no rivals left. He was alone. He stood at the top of a pyramid built from the corpses of his friends and enemies. He was the dictator of France, and he decided the time had come for his most important, most insane project: to build the Republic of Virtue. Having destroyed both the left and the right, Robespierre possessed absolute, unlimited power. The Committee of Public Safety had become his obedient instrument, the Convention a mere voting machine, and he, the Incorruptible, was their undisputed leader. All of France lay at his feet, frozen in a mixture of fear and awe. He had defeated all his enemies, and now he could finally undertake his greatest messianic task: building the ideal state. That Republic of Virtue he had read about in the writings of Rousseau and in the biographies of Spartan heroes. What was this republic? It was a utopia born in the mind of a fanatic. It was to be a world without rich and poor, without luxury and without misery. A world where all citizens would be equal, diligent, patriotic, and above all, virtuous. Quote 35, he said, quote 36. But this was not just a political program. It was a religious mission. Robespierre understood that a society cannot exist without faith. He despised the atheism of the Hébertists, considering it immoral and aristocratic. But he also hated the old Catholicism, which he saw as a breeding ground for superstition and an instrument of oppression. And so he decided to give France a new religion, his own. On May 7th, 1794, he pushed a decree through the convention establishing the cult of the Supreme Being, Culte de l'Être Suprême, in France. This was an abstract, deistic religion in the spirit of Rousseau. It recognized the existence of God, the Supreme Being, and the immortality of the soul. But it had no churches, no priests, and no rituals, apart from Republican festivals. The most important virtues were declared to be love of the fatherland, hatred of tyrants, courage, and modesty. It was an attempt to merge politics and religion, to transform civic duty into a sacred obligation. The apotheosis, the day of Robespierre's greatest triumph, was the Festival of the Supreme Being, set for the 20th of Prairial, June 8th, 1794. All of Paris was adorned with flowers, garlands, and tricolor flags. Huge crowds gathered in the Tuileries garden, and at the center of this grand spectacle, staged by the painter Jacques-Louis David, stood Maximilien Robespierre. He had been unanimously elected president of the convention for that day. He walked at the head of the procession, dressed in his finest sky blue frock coat, with a bouquet of flowers and wheat in his hand. His face, usually pale and inscrutable, was radiant. He approached a gigantic cardboard statue symbolizing atheism and held a torch to it. The statue burned, and from its ashes, through a clever mechanism, another statue, the statue of wisdom, arose. However, it was heavily blackened with soot, which caused some snickering in the crowd. Then he delivered a speech full of mystical pathos. Quote, 37, quote, he proclaimed, quote, 38, quote, he was at his zenith. He was no longer just a dictator. He was the high priest, the Moses delivering new tablets of law to his people. But at that very moment of his triumph, the abyss began to open up beneath him. Many of his colleagues in the convention and the committee watched this spectacle with barely-concealed disgust and fear. They were mostly atheists and cynics. They saw not the birth of a new era, but the manifestation of immense hubris. One of them whispered as a beaming Robespierre walked past them. They met him with icy stares and scornful remarks. Someone threw at him, a reminder of the fate of Roman tyrants. He felt this wall of alienation. His triumph turned into isolation. He was alone on his Olympus. And how did the Incorruptible intend to build his republic of virtue? The answer was simple and terrible: with the help of the guillotine. Immediately after the festival of the Supreme Being, just 2 days later, on June 10th, Robespierre and his supporters rammed a monstrous law through the convention, which went down in history as the quote, 42 __. This law became the legal formalization of madness. It transformed the Revolutionary Tribunal from a court of law into a conveyor belt of death. The law abolished all remaining guarantees for the accused. The definition of quote, 43 __, was expanded to the point of absurdity. Enemies were declared to be anyone who sought to humiliate the convention or the government, who spread false rumors, who corrupted public morals, or who simply did not show enough enthusiasm for the revolution. The preliminary hearing for the accused was abolished, and the role of a defender, the lawyer, was eliminated. Evidence could consist not just of facts, but of any moral or physical considerations. And worst of all, for all crimes falling under the tribunal's jurisdiction, there was now only one punishment: the death penalty. The tribunal could either acquit or guillotine. There was no third option. "Mercy is treason" was one of the slogans of that time. The Great Terror, La Grande Terreur, began. While in the preceding 13 months of the Terror, about 1,300 people were executed in Paris, in the following 49 days that this law was in effect, 1,376 people were sent to the guillotine. The guillotine worked non-stop. Every day, carts full of the condemned rolled to the Place de la Révolution, and all were executed indiscriminately. Aristocrats and maids, generals and peasants, scientists like the great chemist Lavoisier, and poets. Robespierre seemed to have completely lost touch with reality. He rarely appeared at the Committee of Public Safety, but continued to give speeches at the Jacobin Club that grew ever more mystical and threatening. He spoke of the need for purification, that a few more heads must roll to save the Republic. He lived in his own fantasy world, populated by virtuous citizens and treacherous conspirators. He saw conspiracies everywhere, and indeed, intrigues were being woven, but not where he sought them. They were being spun in the heart of his own government. His colleagues in the convention and the committees, even the bloodiest terrorists like Collot d'Herbois, his former companion from Lyon, or below Varennes, were in mortal fear. They saw that Robespierre had turned into an unpredictable tyrant who could at any moment outlaw 100 of them himself. He had become too powerful, too infallible. They knew they were next on his list, and they decided to act before he destroyed them all. They were not idealists. They were pragmatic murderers who wanted to save their own skins. And they began to prepare a coup that would go down in history as the __45_July 1794, or Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, was unnaturally quiet and sultry in Paris. The year 1794 had reached its bloody climax. Every day the carts with the condemned, 30, 40, 50 people at a time, creaked slowly through the streets to the guillotine, which was now operating on the city's outskirts, so its eerie thud would be less a nuisance. The year 1794. Yet behind this conveyor belt of death lay a deep political paralysis. The revolution seemed to have ground to a halt while it devoured itself, and its main engine, Maximilien Robespierre, had disappeared. For more than a month, from mid-June to late July, he was hardly seen in the convention or the Committee of Public Safety, which had been his throne. He shut himself in his modest room at the carpenter Duplay's house, leaving it only for walks with his dog or for speeches at his Jacobin Club. What was happening to him? Was he ill? His fragile health often failed him. Or was it a bout of his usual melancholy, which had now escalated into genuine paranoia? Or was it a cold political calculation? Perhaps, by his absence, he wanted to show colleagues on the committee that they were nothing without him, forcing them to beg him on their knees to return. Whatever the reason, this silence was ominous. It frightened his enemies far more than his speeches. They did not know what he was planning. They sensed he was preparing a new, final blow, a new purge to eliminate all who stood in his way to absolute power. And they were not mistaken. By now he had many enemies, and they were everywhere. The Committee of Public Safety itself, his former comrades turned against him, ultra-terrorists like Collot d'Herbois and below Varennes. They feared him because they sensed he considered them not virtuous enough, too corrupt, and too bloodthirsty. They realized that if he had eliminated Danton for his moderation, he could now eliminate them for their excesses. In the Committee of General Security, which controlled the police and was a rival to the Committee of Public Safety, he was almost universally hated. And in the convention itself, a whole army of Thermidorians was hiding. The surviving Dantonists, the former Hébertists, corrupt deputies whom Robespierre despised, and simply the swamp, le Marais, who feared for their lives. The main organizers of the conspiracy were men who had personal reasons to hate and fear the Incorruptible. Joseph Fouché, the butcher of Lyon, whom Robespierre wanted to put on trial. Tallien, whose mistress, the goddess of Thermidor Teresa Cabarrus, Robespierre had imprisoned. Marat, a cynical aristocrat who had enriched himself through the revolution. Fouché, as in the fight against Robespierre a few months earlier, employed his preferred method. He sowed fear. Like a specter, he moved through Paris by night, meeting with the deputies one by one. "Are you on the list?" he whispered to one. "He will name you tomorrow," he told another. He manufactured an atmosphere of absolute panic, where the only escape was to strike first. Robespierre felt the net closing in. He knew of the conspiracy, but he was too proud, too convinced of his own infallibility and the people's support to stoop to Fouché's methods. He refused to engage in intrigue. He wanted to crush his enemies from the rostrum with a single blow, through the power of his words and his virtue. He decided to deliver a major speech in the convention, unmasking all the villains and demanding from the convention the right to conduct one last, final purge. This was his fatal error. He overestimated his own authority and underestimated the raw, mortal fear of his enemies. On the 8th of Thermidor, the 26th of July, 1794, after a long absence, Maximilien Robespierre finally ascended the rostrum of the convention once more. A dead silence fell over the hall. Everyone awaited the verdict. His speech lasted for 2 hours. It was a strange, ominous speech, full of vague allusions, self-praise, and threats. He spoke of himself as a martyr surrounded by enemies. He spoke of a league of scoundrels that had entrenched itself in the heart of the government, within the committees. He called for the renewal of the Committee of Public Safety, the purge of the Committee of General Security, and the punishment of traitors. He threatened, he spread terror, but he made the same mistake he had made before Danton's execution. Only this time, the mistake would prove fatal. He did not name a single person. This uncertainty was more terrifying than any specific accusation. Everyone in the hall, from the most ardent terrorists to the moderates in the quote, 52 had to assume he was the one being targeted. When he finished, he was applauded out of sheer habit. The convention even voted to have his speech printed. It seemed as if he had won again, but the conspirators were already prepared. One of them, Cambon, whom Robespierre had indirectly mentioned, dared to object. Quote 53, quote, he cried. Quote 54, quote. This was the first spark. Others then began to demand that Robespierre name those he accused. He refused with contempt. Quote 55, quote, he said. Quote 56, quote. That evening, he went to the Jacobin Club and read his speech once more. There, he was met with a thunderous ovation. The Jacobins shouted that they would march with him to the convention the next day and force the deputies to submit. Quote, the painter David said enthusiastically. Robespierre replied coldly, already sensing that he was losing. He rejected an armed uprising, still naively believing in the power of his speech. The night of the 8th to the 9th of Thermidor became a night of agony and secret negotiations. That night, the work of Fouché and Tallien bore fruit. All the fearful, all the wavering, all who hated Robespierre, united. They agreed not to let him speak the next day. 9th of Thermidor, the 27th of July. The session of the convention began with a speech by Saint-Just, who intended to read the indictment, but he did not even manage to say 2 words. He was interrupted by Talleyrand, waving a dagger in the air. Talleyrand screamed that he was ready to pierce the heart of the new tyrant if the convention did not dare to arrest him. This was the signal. A pre-orchestrated chaos erupted. The deputies shouted over one another, rushing to accuse Robespierre. Roared the hall. Robespierre, deathly pale, paced back and forth at the rostrum, trying to say something, but his voice was lost in the noise. The president of the convention, Collot d'Herbois, his mortal enemy, rang his bell incessantly to drown him out. Robespierre, gasping with rage and powerlessness, could only croak. "The blood of Danton chokes you," someone shouted at him. His voice failed him. "President of murderers," he said, turning to Collot. "For the last time, I ask for the floor." But he was not allowed to speak. The convention, which had trembled before him only yesterday, was now intoxicated by its sudden courage and voted for his arrest. Along with him, his brother Augustin, Saint-Just, Couthon, and other loyal followers were arrested. But this was not the end. The Paris Commune, the city government dominated by the Jacobins, remained loyal to Robespierre. It sounded the alarm. The jailers refused to accept the prisoners, and so they were freed. Robespierre and his friends gathered at the city hall, Hôtel de Ville. They could have armed the people, the sans-culottes, and led them to storm the convention, but they hesitated. Robespierre, a lawyer through and through, hesitated to declare himself a rebel. This indecision was their downfall. The convention, for its part, acted swiftly and decisively. It declared Robespierre and his followers outside the law, hors la loi. This meant they could be executed without trial, merely upon identification. Troops loyal to convention, under the command of Marat, surrounded the city hall. The assault began during the night. When the soldiers stormed the hall where the conspirators were gathered, a terrible scene met their eyes. The paralyzed Couthon had tried to kill himself, but had only fallen from his wheelchair. Saint-Just calmly awaited his arrest, and Augustin Robespierre threw himself from a window, breaking both his legs. Maximilien Robespierre himself lay on the floor in a pool of blood. He had tried to shoot himself, but the bullet had only shattered his jaw. Disfigured and bleeding, he was dragged to the Committee of Public Safety and thrown onto the very table where he had decided the fate of thousands. He lay there for hours in silence, in terrible agony, as his former colleagues walked past, hurling insults at him. Then he was taken to prison. On the 10th of Thermidor, the 28th of July, 1794, Maximilien Robespierre and 21 of his closest associates were taken to the Place de la Révolution without trial. When the bandage holding his shattered jaw was torn off, he let out a wild, inhuman scream of pain. It was the last sound he ever made. An instant later, the blade of the guillotine ended his life. Thus ended the story of the Incorruptible. He sought to build a republic of virtue, and instead erected a pyramid of severed heads upon which his own was finally placed. He sincerely believed he was saving France, but he only plunged it into even greater terror. His tragedy is an eternal warning to all who believe that a great cause can be achieved through violence, and that living people can be sacrificed in the present for the happiness of the future.